What are your overall thoughts on the season so far for Indiana and how it's transpired? And I know the positiveness of it, but just in general, game by game, what are some of the things that you think stand out to you positively and negatively about this season so far?
I mean, it's a great question because, for a lot of teams being 6-0, it wouldn't really be a big deal. Like, especially if your schedule is as easy as Indiana's has been to start the year. The issue is, though, when trying to find a lot of negatives for Indiana is the fact that they're 6-0 for the first time since 1967. We're
That's
not
crazy.
talking
Yep.
about a program that, like 9 out of the last, 10
Yep.
seasons, they start out 5-0, 6-0, whatever. I mean, it is just incredible what's going on in Indiana, especially considering the last 3 years of poor play that they've had. I know the 2019-2020 seasons, like people say,
Mhm.
well, Indiana's been good recently. They can, it's possible, but still, Indiana football historically is just awful. The losing is
Yeah.
power for team in college football history. So
It's like Nebraska
definitely.
basketball. So
Absolutely. It's kind of funny how Indiana basketball and Nebraska football are similar, and Nebraska basketball and Indiana football are similar. That's
good.
wild.
It's like that
But
Spider-Man meme where we're just both pointing at each other. But
absolutely. But I do think that, to look at just, maybe I guess you would say some of the negatives, because obviously, like, the positives of the fact that Indiana's winning when they never have at this rate,
yeah.
is like, you could say, their defense at times, like you said, the physicality. I agree. Like, the defensive line, it's not an elite defensive line. They have
Mhm.
one guy who's going to probably be an NFL player, Mikael Kamara. He's good. He has like 5 sacks on the season, but everybody else is just okay. They're not
Mhm.
great on run defense. I mean, they're not horrible, but they really haven't played anybody that's really pressured them in that regard either. Even though Nebraska's not the best running offense in the world either, but
Mhm.
still, maybe Nebraska will be able to expose that more so than some of the other teams that they've played. I mean, it's just tough to find a lot of negatives, though. I mean, they've
Yeah.
blown out everybody that they've played, basically. I mean, they're breaking records left and right. I mean, it was becoming like a meme online that every week Indiana was breaking some record.
Yeah.
So they're just doing so well overall. I mean, definitely the UCLA game was glorious. The fact Indiana got their first ever win in the Rose Bowl, that was awesome to see. I know UCLA is not very good, but actually Indiana has beaten UCLA by more points than any of the other teams that have played them. Penn State didn't even beat them by as much. LSU
Yep.
didn't beat them by as much. So I don't believe in the transitive property on that of how a team plays compared to others, but that is a good sign.
Yeah.
Just overall, like Indiana, when they've had some struggles, like Rourke threw 2 interceptions against Maryland, the only 2 picks that he's had all season. He bounced back from it, still threw for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. So
Yeah.
every time Indiana, makes a mistake or two, they bounce back, turn it around, and their defense was not great against Northwestern, but their offense was fantastic. So just
Yeah.
seeing week by week, couple mistakes, couple areas they need to get better at, but then they just find ways to keep improving, and that's why they're 6-0, despite an easy schedule, but still impressive for Indiana.
Yeah, and I think that was my biggest thing that got me the kind of concerns or questions about the physicality too. Not only that, but there is, because of the JMU transfers, of course, and so them being new to the Big Ten, and they've shown their ability to be physical against Maryland and Northwestern. But kind of watching that Northwestern game, Northwestern kind of went blow for blow with them up until the end, and then they kind of ran out of gas. Do you think that was just kind of an aberration or an outlier on your defense between them and Maryland? Do you think there was just some mistakes that can easily be cleaned up, or is that kind of something that you think can be an issue against Nebraska? Do you think that defense is leaky to an extent, or do you think they'll lock it down?
I mean, it's kind of tough because obviously, I'm sure you probably do the same thing. But when you like a team and you're watching a game, you I wouldn't say make excuses, but when you watch stuff, like sometimes your bias kind of leans over. I really try not to have bias in that regard. I don't,
Yeah,
because some people are really bad. Like they let their blinders affect their thinking big
yeah,
time. But
for sure.
that Maryland game, honestly, because I know most people besides Indiana fans and Maryland fans did not watch that game. There were a lot of other better games on, but Indiana should have won that game by a lot more than they did. There was one play literally, and it did show up on Twitter, but the defensive back for Indiana, D'Angelo Pons, who's one of the best defenders on the team, he got blocked accidentally by the referee, and he would have made a sure-handed tackle in the backfield, and it ended up being a 75-yard run for a touchdown for Maryland.
Yeah.
So that was probably the worst mistake Indiana's had all season long on a massive explosive play. Like, they have not given up explosive plays. A lot of it's been like short, like 10, 15, 5-yard completions and runs. Like, they haven't been like getting blown out over the top. But that run by Roman Hemby, 75-yard touchdown run, that looked bad on paper, like, man, Indiana gave up a big run like that. It was because the referee blocked D'Angelo Pons. And then there was another play in that game where I don't even know how this counted, but it was like 3rd 17. Maryland throws a pass, and the guy was like halfway out of bounds. He fell on his backside, and he was literally like half of himself was out of bounds, but they said that half of his body counted being inbounds. I don't know how that is, but they counted it. Even the commentators were like, that shouldn't have counted. And then Maryland scored a touchdown off like 3 guys tipping it up in the air, including an Indiana player, and then somehow it was caught. So, like, Indiana could have easily won like 49-14, but the game was a lot closer because of those 2 plays.
And what you're talking about the officiating, I feel like officiating has just been, I don't know about you, but I feel like it's been horrible in college football this year, like terrible. It's just missed calls, more than I've ever seen. I don't know if any of it has to do with betting, but it's weird how much it's ramping up and getting worse. But with that being said, what are some of the things, when we talk about strength on strength, it's Nebraska's defense versus this Indiana offense. And I think Fongway's got a good point here. If the D sits back, plays that loose zone type stuff, the QB is going to pick them apart because Curtis Rourke loves to target that middle of the field. And the thing is, if you give them cushion, like, he's got the touch and he's got the ability to put the ball right where it needs to be. And that's what he's done so far this season. What are some of the things, because, looking at his numbers too, he throws, really well under pressure, just like he does with a clean pocket. But going against Nebraska's D-line and the defense that, allows, under 13 points per game, a rush defense has given up, no rushing touchdowns. What are some problems that you think our defense presents for Indiana's offense?
It's a great question. I mean, the thing with Indiana in the last 4 to 5 years, which is why Tom Allen ultimately ended up getting fired, was the fact that their offensive line was terrible, and Tom Allen would not fire the offensive line coach because he never fired anybody because, he was friends with everybody that was the coaches. That's fair. But the O-line was terrible. Indiana's offensive line is not bad this year. I wouldn't say it's like top 3 or 4 in the Big Ten, but they got a couple guys that might be draft picks. I mean, saying that for Indiana is unreal. Like, that don't happen, but very often. But the offensive line's a lot better. Indiana's running the ball very well. They got multiple running backs with tons of touchdowns. Their top 2 guys have like 5 rushing touchdowns, 4 rushing touchdowns, ranking very well in the Big Ten. And the reason, like you said, that Rourke has been able to have the season that he's had is because, he's making the throws, but he's had time to get rid of the ball.
Yeah.
So really, to be honest, Nebraska's probably by far the best defense that Indiana's going to face. I would have thought maybe it would have been Northwestern, but Northwestern's defense kind of was awful against Indiana. So I don't know if it's the case that Northwestern really hasn't played anybody that could expose their defense until Indiana. So definitely, I do think Nebraska, it's going to be interesting because they have the most talent of any team Indiana's played on defense. If they can get to Rourke and he is under pressure, he could make a lot of mistakes because he really hasn't been pressured to this point all that much. Because really, even the 2 interceptions he had against Maryland, it was actually wide receivers basically running the route wrong both times. You don't ever, like, Rourke didn't blame those guys. Signetti didn't blame those guys. Like, you don't do that. You own up to the mistakes and you go back out there and play good. That's how, you don't want to do that. But it wasn't really Rourke's fault. He's been basically perfect. But, I mean, those 2 picks weren't even really his fault. So 14 touchdowns, basically no errors. He's played fantastic, but he really hasn't been pressured to this point. So Indiana's offensive line is a lot better. But, again, they haven't really been pressured. So if Nebraska can get pressure on Rourke and Indiana's O-line and not allow them to run the ball, because that's something else Indiana's been able to do. They've been able to run the ball so much.
That was my next question. So we can lead into that. Like, what, we talk about the Indiana pass game. Give me some insight into the Indiana run game.
I mean, the thing I like about the run game is that a lot of teams have one guy. They have a main dominant back, and if he's not, like 100% healthy, you don't have any other options. Or,
Mhm.
if he's running out of gas, or just a type of back that he is. I mean,
Yeah.
like back in the day, like when you had Alabama with like an
Like a
Eddie
bell
Lacy,
cow.
who was just a Mack truck, but then they
Adrian
had DJ
Peterson.
Yeldon, who was the speedster. You
Yep.
had those two different options. Now, obviously, Indiana doesn't have either of guys that good, but they have different guys at running back. Really, they have a three-headed monster because Justice Ellison is really good. I mean, he's kind of a do-it-all back. He's got some power, but he's got speed as well. And then you got Tyson Lawton. He's the big guy. He's the big power back that just bruises for 3 or 4 yards like every single play. And then you got Kalen Black, who's kind of a little bit of both as well, has more of the power of Lawton, but still some speed like Ellison. And then Elijah Green, who they don't even play that much, he's the speedster. Like,
Yeah.
honestly, I don't know why he doesn't play more, because he's fast. When he gets out in the open field, he's really good, but they don't play him that much because I guess, the other guys they trust more or whatever. But still, like, Indiana has diversity at running back in their guys that they can use. Like during the Stevie Scott era, it was just Stevie Scott. Like that was it.
Yeah.
Like you had Peyton Ramsey, Michael Penix, and then it was Stevie Scott, and nobody really behind him that was able to really contribute all that much. Now they have multiple different guys that can, scare a defense, not super heavily, but good enough. And I really think the offensive line being better has contributed to their success. Because if it was the offensive line under Tom Allen the last couple of years, these guys wouldn't be doing anything. Even though I do think that they're upgrades at running back, because every single running back Indiana has, they're all transfers. They're all new. None of these guys were on last year's team. So the offensive line's contributing to it, but the running backs, I like their different styles of play that can confuse a defense.
For sure. And shout out Jackson. I just want to say shout out to you. Thank you so much for the $5, man. It's greatly appreciated. I appreciate everybody who even stops in, likes the stream, comments, super chats, man. I appreciate it. So thank you so much, Jackson. We really appreciate that. So now let's go a little bit into, I'm going to just kind of ask a general question here about who, in your opinion, is, it could be multiple players, but who, in your opinion, is the key for Indiana to win this game? Maybe like an under the radar. We know Curtis Rourke, but who are some other guys who you think are going to need to step up for Indiana to win this game?
It's a great question. You're talking about both offense and defense, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Absolutely. So, I mean, he's not an underrated guy, but Elijah Surratt has been incredible for Indiana. And I'm really surprised that he's not further up on draft boards. I don't know if it's because it's Indiana. Like, I feel like there's an Indiana effect where you're playing at Indiana, so you're not going to get recognition for the draft. But Elijah Surratt statistically has been one of the best receivers in the Big Ten. He's reliable. He doesn't drop balls. Ironically, Indiana's wide receiver room only has one drop among the whole team this season. One drop in 6 games as the whole unit. I don't even know how it's feasible. So Rourke's been on the money, but the receivers have been uber reliable. So that's another thing with that. But Elijah Surratt, he's just an all-around wide receiver. And the thing is you could say, well, yeah, Nebraska can shut him down, but Indiana's wide receiver room's deep. Keyshawn Williams, he's been emerging lately because Miles Price and Miles Cross are two kind of slot receivers who have been basically the main two guys for Indiana. But Keyshawn Williams has been coming around. He's another slot guy. They got like 3 different slot receivers, but Keyshawn Williams, the Wake Forest transfer, has gotten a whole lot more recognition in the last couple of weeks for his play. He had like a 50-yard reception where he caught like a little screen route, and then he was just running all over the place. Just a little guy, kind of like, I wouldn't say Whop Philyor level yet because he hasn't played as much, but he could get there. So he's good as well. Zach Horton at tight end is probably the most underrated player on the entire team because he only has like 90 receiving yards. So he's not getting any recognition because he's not catching a lot of balls, but his blocking is incredible. That's another reason that the run game's been so good. He's a fantastic run blocker. And then on defense, I mentioned Mikel Kamara, but he's going to be a guy everybody's going to pay attention to because he's one of the sack leaders in the Big Ten. But D'Angelo Pons definitely is key because Indiana secondary, I wouldn't say it's leaky, but they can get exposed at times. But Pons is only 5'9", but he's so good. I mean, he doesn't give up receptions hardly ever. even though he's going up against guys that are like 6'3", 6'4". Ty Felton for Maryland, who's been basically the best part of their team. He
He's
only had
Maryland.
30
He's their
receiving
like
yards
only
against
target.
Indiana.
Yeah, he's like their only target. Like he had a crazy amount of their percentage of overall production. Yeah.
He only had 30 receiving yards, though, against Indiana. And, like, in the other games besides that, he's been averaging like 100 receiving yards. So, definitely, D'Angelo Pons is a big reason for that. So, I would say D'Angelo Pons is key. And definitely Jalen Walker and Aiden Fisher at linebacker for Indiana as well, because they're probably the two best defenders on the team outside of Mikel Kamara, but they don't get as much attention because Mikel Kamara has the statistics to back it up. But those guys have definitely been good in the run defense as well.
Yeah, and David has a good question here that I was going to kind of go into. You know, that crowd, of course, is going to be raucous and probably more of an atmosphere than you've probably seen, you know, maybe in a long time, if not your lifetime. Now, how much of a factor do you think, and I know, because I know it can be a factor, but, you know, when Indiana and that stadium is rocking, like how much of a factor do you think it can be in the game?
It's a great question because, honestly, the only time I can remember Indiana's crowd being a key component to the game was that Cincinnati game in 2021. They were coming off the great season in 2020.
Yeah.
There were no fans because it was the pandemic year. And in 2021, they came into the season ranked, but Penix was not healthy. And that crowd did impact the game. Like, they definitely helped out the team stay in that game. And unfortunately, a very bad targeting call that they put on Micah McFadden ended any chance Indiana had to win in that game. He was doing everything on defense. But that crowd, though, was there in that game, and it was very loud. And I think Cincinnati, like Ritter, was definitely struggling a little bit at first, but then they came back, won the game. But this year, I mean, the crowd's been pretty awful this year. I'm not going to lie. A lot of Indiana fans don't like hearing that, but Curt Cignetti's basically been like, I wouldn't say begging, but he's been like, come on, guys, like we're winning games here. You know, I'm here to build this team. You got to do your part. Because against Charlotte, Western Illinois, you know, teams like that, there was no crowd. It was weak. And obviously, you know, those are bad teams, but that's what people talk about with Nebraska. They have the best fans on earth because their team's been really bad for a while, and they still show up. They still sell out the crowd no matter who they're playing. It could be a FCS team. They still sell it out. So Indiana's not at that point. But now that they're winning, and that Maryland game, it wasn't a sellout, but it was very close. It impacted Maryland. It was pretty loud. It's the loudest I've ever heard it on TV since that Cincinnati game. Now, this game's going to be sold out. So I think it's going to be comparable to that Cincinnati crowd back in 2021. And you can hear it on the TV. I mean, Indiana, when they're good and they have a reason to cheer, they're good. They're just not like Nebraska where they'll cheer whenever. Like whoever they're playing, maybe that will come with time if they keep winning and Cignetti stays. But since this is a big game, big noon kickoff, it's a sellout. And I know a lot of Nebraska fans have been trolling on Twitter like, oh, well, it's going to be half of us there, like at the Colorado game. I don't think so. I think it's going to be at least, like Will says right there, 70-30 IU. That's my opinion. I think 70-75% of it will be Indiana fans. It's not going to be like Colorado. I don't see it. Now, if it is, I think that will really be tough, but I don't see it.
There was a built-in incentive for us to take over Colorado Stadium, though, because they were actively trying to keep Nebraska fans from being able to buy tickets. So if you had a address in Nebraska, I don't think you could buy tickets from their website or something like that. And so Nebraska fans were going to get season tickets so they could, and then sold all the rest of them except for the Nebraska game, so that way they could get into the game. So yeah, they bring a little bit more incentive. But yeah, our fans do travel very well. But at the same time, you know, this is a situation where Indiana, as excited as they are, probably aren't selling a ton of tickets like out to other people. So that will be something to really watch too. It's not like, I don't know if we would even be able to tell. They're both red, so you know, it'd be hard to look in the
because Nebraska fans are saying that too. I love the Twitter debate back and forth about the crowd. Well, we're all going to be red, so you're not going to be able to tell until
I think that's a legitimate. I mean, that's a legitimate thing, because I was just thinking that. I was just like, well, I'm not going to be able to tell the difference probably just with the TV being quick panning, you know, and stuff like that. Maybe if I was there, but not with the TV. As little as they show the crowd, I'm like, I don't even know if we'll be able to tell. Got to go by the noise probably to be able to tell. But
absolutely. I mean, for me, because I do feel a big key to this game is whether Indiana can get pressure on Raiola, because he's a young guy. He is a very inexperienced player, but he's very talented, and he's only going to get better, I believe, because
Yep.
he already, to me, has been getting better since the beginning of the season. He's been playing better, even though he still has, mistakes, and sometimes he could do better at, reading the
Yeah.
defense. But
Naturally.
do you think that Raiola will be able to handle, a semi, I wouldn't say like super tough road environment, but a semi-tough road environment against Indiana and against Indiana's defense that is better than it's been? Like, do you believe that he will be able to handle the pressure?
Yeah, and it's tough to say, how, because our road opponents, Purdue wasn't very good, so we haven't seen that, but I do get, big game situations. One of the things I said going to the Colorado game is I thought that was a great experience for him to be able to play in a big moment that has a lot of meaning to the university and the fans, and it's a pivotal game against a team that Nebraska should be. And I thought that was good for him to get that experience and get that confidence and not go against like an Ohio State and get blown out. So we've seen him operate under the pressure. But then my big concern coming into the season was how, what happens against the physical teams. I thought Illinois and Rutgers, mainly Rutgers initially, and then Illinois started playing really well. But I knew Illinois is a physical team, but I thought Rutgers was going to be, the better team. But just their physicality concerned me in terms of how they match up. Styles make fights, kind of like we were talking about before. And I think those two physical games, especially against against Rutgers, because Rutgers actually did put a lot of heat on them, and our offense wasn't moving the ball very well. But that I did a video on that. That had a lot to do with play sequencing, in my opinion. But there were mistakes, right? And it seemed like, he threw the interception, and it seemed like he tightened up a little bit after that. The interception he was kind of baited. It was his first like real freshman mistake. He was kind of baited in the throw. The linebacker stepped up. He was trying to throw the RPO quick slant, and the linebacker backed up and just kind of lurked him, And so I think he's built for the pressure. I really think this is one of those situations where I want Nebraska to definitely try to be playing with a lead and not trying to play catch up. That way, Nebraska can run their offense and be able to run the ball and set him up. Because last week, when we were in a bunch of third and longs, and the reason we were in third and longs is when, Satterfield is passing laterally. When he's passing to the outsides, or jet sweeps, we didn't get a ton of yards on those. Those weren't working. The drives that we scored on against Rutgers, we balanced it out, ran the ball, passed the ball, and we stayed ahead of the line of scrimmage. Every time we throw it laterally behind the line of scrimmage, it ends up killing our drives. And so I think a lot of it's going to come down to really the play sequencing and getting him into a rhythm. I think once he's in a rhythm, it's just ball, But when you have to think, when you're going to be a half second late, and we saw that because Raiola missed a couple. He had a wheel route that was open, but it's some of those timing routes, right? You have a split second window to hit that route before it closes up, and that led to a couple sacks. So, but the good thing about that is, I talked about this after the Illinois game, that the defensive film on Illinois, I wasn't really worried about our defense after that game, because I was like, the real testament of our defense will be how they respond once they go in and watch the film. If we trust the coaches, we should trust them to respond. And I'm keeping that same approach about the offense. It's going to come down to how they respond, and how Dylan responds is going to tell us a lot. Coming off of that game where we only scored 14 points, a lot of question marks around the offense. Does he come out and just kind of sling it around the field and kind of reestablish himself? Because he doesn't seem like a guy who's really rattled by much, or a moment's too big for him. But this is a huge game for both teams, so it'll be interesting, that dynamic, to see how it plays out. But like the biggest thing for me was seeing how, when he gets roughed up, when he gets hit, and some big bodies land on him, those Big Ten guys start really hitting him. How, once his body got some wear and tear, how is that going to go? And last week I think it was a combination of execution issues, and those can't happen against Indiana. The offense needs to be. So that's why I think the bye week was important for us to be able to kind of fine tune some of those execution things and keep everything ahead of the sticks, kind of cut down on some of these dumb penalties that were a couple of drive killers last time and really, implement our game plan and do what we do well and stop trying to, I guess, deviate from that, get a little too creative or a little too complex. And then also, I just think we need to target the middle of the field, the intermediate level of the field a little more. We're throwing a lot of deep routes. But if we utilize the middle of the field more, especially even on 3rd and longs, 3rd and 10, we don't always have to throw 15, 20 yards. Even if we check it down underneath and try to let our athletes make some plays, like you got to just keep it moving. And I think it's been a little too much of all or nothing so far. And I just think there needs to be consistency from our offense to keep him in a rhythm for sure. So,
but Indiana football is like in the top 10 to 15 in college football. I don't know the exact number, but I know they're in the top 10 to 15 in college football on the amount of 3rd downs they've had. They barely had any. So that's a big thing I think Nebraska has to do to Indiana is put them in 3rd down. Can Indiana convert when there's pressure? Because, they've barely ever had 3rd downs. I mean, like, they've just been rolling on offense.
Yeah.
Like, they're just getting 1st and 10s. They're just getting chunk plays. So, absolutely.
Do you think that potentially becomes an issue if Indiana needs to kind of slow the game down and kind of, work those 3rd downs a little bit, try to get to, 3rd and 1s and try to just, in terms of kind of milking the clock? Do you think they have the ability to dial it back and do that and control the clock if they are in a situation where maybe it's the 4th quarter tight game and they're just trying to get out of there, Do you think that's something they're able to do is control the clock in that time of possession like that?
It's a great question because, I mean, we've seen some teams really struggle with clock management this year, including Alabama. I mean, they've been terrible with clock management, absolutely horrible. Like, they're still playing up-tempo with the lead late in the game. That makes no sense. You don't do that. The thing with Indiana, though, is even though their offense has been great so far this season, they actually rank toward the bottom in college football in tempo. They're already running a pretty slow offense, so they use the majority of the clock every single time.
Yeah.
They just have success when they run their offense. It isn't super quick, though. So I think they can. I think the key just for Indiana is the fact if they have the lead and you want to milk the clock, can they run the ball against Nebraska's defense? Because Indiana's been running the ball very well, but they haven't really played anybody with a good run defense until, I guess, Northwestern. But Indiana did run the ball very well on Northwestern. So I'm not super concerned, but I am more concerned against Nebraska than anybody else that they've played. But I would say, yes, I think Indiana can do that. I just think that the way that they've been having success on offense, they haven't had to have 3rd downs because Rourke's been throwing 15-yard passes downfield.
Yeah.
I mean, 1st and 10, 1st down, 1st and 10,
doesn't,
first down.
It doesn't mean necessarily they're not capable of it.
Convert 3rd downs if they had to, if they're just running the ball. I think they could.
You think Nebraska matches up better with Indiana than they did with Illinois?
A good question.
I think yes, because the physicality of Illinois is what ruled the day and wore us down. And that was my concern to begin with, because there was one drive where they hit 5 3rd downs, 5 3rd downs, and they scored a touchdown, but they were just methodical. They had the H-back and they were using the H-back in a myriad of different ways. And then they snuck them out for a couple passes. They kind of worked everything in systematically, and they were just getting a 3rd and short and converting. But then Nebraska comes down and scores in 3 plays. And I'm not going to be upset about a touchdown, but your defense is right back on the field. And Illinois was able to wear on us. Not only that, their game plan got our defense on their heels, but Illinois was able to wear on Nebraska a bit. And wear on the run defense, because the defense, early on was stopping the run pretty well. Overall, if you look at the yards per carry, but the run game was getting some 8-10 yard carries in the second half. That's where I think, because since Nebraska is a very physical team, that's where I think Illinois was the bad matchup or the tougher matchup, just because it's physicality on physicality. Who's going to win, and who's going to implement their game plan. With Indiana, I just think it's 2 different styles contrasting. And there's no way for me, like, it's so hard to really pinpoint how these teams match up, because they're both in like their first good season in a while. And so it's 2 completely different teams. And to be fair, our schedule hasn't been a world beater of a schedule either. So 2 teams that, have played a couple of difficult matchups.
Mhm.
And we just don't know necessarily how they match up with each other, just because it's such a new couple of styles of these two teams. And that's the most interesting part. But I think the physical matchups are what I was scared of, especially with the true freshman QB,
Mhm.
especially with the lack of depth at our O-line and our secondary. So yeah, but I'm not, that's the one thing, kind of to your point, Indiana, it's not that they can't do these things. It's just that they haven't had to yet. And that'll be the big thing as to where Indiana matches up with us, is if they can do some of the things that, are going to play into our weaknesses and maybe bring a little bit of that physicality to us, and maybe punch us in the mouth a little bit and see how we respond from there.
Mhm.
I just feel like it's going to be, explosiveness, and Nebraska's offense is explosive at times, but I think it's going to be, methodical drives versus, Indiana just kind of trying to get their chunk plays. But Curtis Rourke sets that up, because I was watching some film from Indiana, and it's all set up because he targets that middle of the field, very
Mhm.
well, especially like the intermediate level.
Mhm.
And then the linebackers it'll bring the linebackers down, and then he just throws it over the top of them in that zone coverage. So Nebraska's going to have to get very creative with their coverages too. And
Mhm.
but I do think Illinois' game plan on film, I think that helped Nebraska's defense a ton, because they
Mhm.
have tightened up. But this is the best offense we've faced this year. So yeah, I definitely think off rip, I would say Illinois, but we should know a lot more
Mhm.
this Saturday. Can Indiana score a rushing TD against us? I don't know. That's tough, because Kyle Monangai got 4 shots from the 1 yard line. They ran 6 plays from the 1 yard line and couldn't get in. Rutgers.
I will say the difference, though, and not to discredit Rutgers, but like you said, Rutgers doesn't have a good passing offense, though. And see, when you have a great running back and you have to stop that guy, it puts all of the eyes on defense like, hey, we just got to shut him down. With
I,
Indiana, it's like you got to worry about the passing attack so much that it might be a little bit easier for Indiana to run on Nebraska than it was
yeah.
for Rutgers, because Nebraska knew that that's what
Well,
Rutgers was going to do.
specifically, I'm just talking about that goal line stand.
Absolutely. I
Because
agree.
what my game plan, what I said Nebraska needed to do going to the Rutgers game, was have a multiple touchdown lead by
Mhm.
half, and carry that into the second half, and kind of try to keep it within a double-digit score, because then you force Ethan Kaliakmanis to try to beat you with his arm. And everything Kirk Shiroka likes to do
Mhm.
on Rutgers plays off of Kyle Monangai. He scripts everything off of that outside zone, inside zone, RPOs, run action passes. Like, they took that away, and Ethan Kaliakmanis had to turn into a pocket passer, and that just wasn't there. Now we're facing a pocket passer. Yeah. So the style transition there too is going to be very interesting. Now here's a question. How can Indiana O-line handle Nebraska front seven? Because in years past, that was one of Indiana's biggest issues, is their O-line play.
I agree. I mean, definitely Indiana's O line. I mean, I like that's one of the biggest things. Like I've tried to defend Tom Allen. I mean, I even toward the end, I'm like, he's a good coach overall with the energy and being able to give a team hope. And he had the success with the good coordinators, especially Kalen DeBoer. I mean, now he's the Alabama head coach, even though he's getting scrutiny now, but still he's a good coach. But
Yeah.
then all that folded, and then lost the coordinators, and then you had a terrible offensive line coach. You had terrible offensive line play, and it gave Indiana no chance. I mean, Penix would have never transferred to Washington, but he was getting his body destroyed. I
Yeah.
mean, he would not be in the NFL right now, or been a Heisman candidate and all that kind of stuff. Had all the success he had if he didn't get out of Indiana, because his body would have been
Or
completely
get out of the
destroyed.
Big Ten.
I mean, honestly, I'm just glad that he ended up being able to recover and have success, because we're seeing
Yeah.
other quarterbacks like Cam Rising can't stay healthy, and his
Yeah.
career is just going in the floor. So I'm glad Penix got out of Indiana when he did, and I'm saying that as an Indiana fan. He needed to leave
Yeah.
because he was not going to survive. Indiana doesn't have that problem anymore. The O-line has a couple guys that should be draft picks. Like, I keep referencing this. Indiana has probably 5 or 6 guys that if they're not drafted, I don't know what people are doing. I
Yeah.
really don't. Like, they should be drafted, but they're not getting any recognition. I mean, Curtis Rourke right now is, and bad teams that they've played, but Curtis Rourke right now is 10th in the Heisman voting, and he's not even on the draft boards at all. Not even in the 7th round. He's nowhere. He's not even in the 7th round on any
That's
draft
crazy.
board, and he's 10th in the Heisman voting. Now,
As
obviously,
long as he keeps winning, he'll definitely be
I
up
mean,
there.
I know he will, but like
Yeah.
if he was anywhere else right now, he would be
Yeah,
on the board.
yeah. If he was at a
He
big
would be
school,
on
he
the
would.
board.
Yeah, even if
So
he
it's
was at
a
like
big game for
Colorado.
Rourke in Indiana because if he plays well against Nebraska and Indiana's offensive line plays well against Nebraska, then these guys are going to start showing up because that's a huge win. But I do think Indiana's O-line is significantly better. I think that they're going to get to Rourke a couple times. It's not like they're going to be able to keep him upright all game. But I do believe that Indiana's O-line is so much better to the point where I do believe that they'll be able to hold up for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah. And to kind of piggyback off that a little bit, just kind of with Indiana and their offense, just in your opinion, because I've kind of broke down what I saw from Indiana's offense just in watching a couple games of film, but how would you break down, the system or the systematic approach of Indiana's offense? Like, how do they create offense? For instance, with, like I said, with Illinois, it's just they stick to their game plan, they stick to what they do, and they build off of a formation, and they have plays that they use in situations off of that formation, and that's kind of how and then they slowly wear on you, and they try to get that run game going. What would you say is Indiana's approach and how they kind of open these guys up?
It's a great question. I mean, the thing is like I said, it's an interesting offense because of the fact that they don't do a lot of trick plays. They've done a little bit more than Tom Allen toward the end, where it was just basically running up the middle, and then on 3rd down you had to throw it. Which I'm like, what are you doing? You're going to run the ball on 1st and 2nd down every time. They're going to stop it, and then you throw on 3rd down. So I will say it's not like a very complicated offense. It's not a lot of trick plays, different schemes, and all that kind of stuff. And it's not up tempo. Like a lot of people assume this offense is up tempo because they're scoring a lot of points. It's not. It's really, I wouldn't say methodical, but it's just like they take most of the time on the shot clock, or the game clock rather.
They're efficient.
They're just efficient, like you said. I mean, they just run their offense. And the other thing with Tom Allen too is the fact that during his tenure, they would have like the first drive they would script it, and it was perfect, and they would score like almost every time. Like if you remember against Michigan, remember Indiana was tied like 10-10 at the half, and then Michigan ended up beating them by like 30 a couple years ago. It's because like Indiana started out the game, they had all their plays written down, and then once they ran through that, they had nothing, and they had no other play calls. They ran through all of them. So, yeah, he did do a respectable job. That's why I keep talking about him, because he did a lot of great things for Indiana. And honestly, even though Indiana was 3-9 last year, Cignetti would not have been able to come in and have this success off the bat if Tom Allen was a really bad coach. He was not. The foundation was there. He just couldn't keep it going. So, definitely, like, Indiana's offense, very methodical. It's a mix of run and pass. I would say they pass a little bit more, but it is about 50-50. They do run the ball a decent amount, and it's not always on 1st down. I mean, they'll have like an 8-yard completion on 1st down, and then they'll run on 2nd down, or they'll sometimes run on 1st down. It's just mixing it up.
And they
like
don't
you
run
said, a lot of intermediate
action.
passes, not a lot of deep throws, not even a lot of short stuff. Like I would argue, like throw some more like screen passes and use the blockers. No, it's a lot of just intermediate stuff. So if Nebraska could shut down the intermediate game, then I'm like, will Indiana be able to throw downfield or the short game to counter that? Because literally it's like 15 yards, just over that first line of defense. That's why Rourke should be on draft boards, because he's making passes that like 90% of quarterbacks can't make.
Oh, he's making some unbelievable throws.
Absolutely.
And it's consistency. Like, you just got to admire consistency week in and week out. I don't care who you play. People struggle against bad teams. It's the consistency is something that needs to be talked about more, for sure. Let's go ahead and I guess we'll go ahead and, do you have a prediction in mind first off?
I do have a prediction. I had to go back and forth. I will say that I've been going back and forth on these two teams because I think it's a coin flip. I do not agree with the 6.5 point spread. I mean, it's cool seeing Indiana favored by that much, but I think it's 50-50. So I got a score prediction, but it took me a while to finally make my prediction.
What is it?
Well, I would say that looking at both teams, it's even. And I think that the strengths and weaknesses of both teams are, even though they're different weaknesses and strengths, they average out to both teams being around the same. Even though Nebraska has the one loss, and they're not ranked, and Indiana's ranked 16th, that doesn't mean Indiana's better.
Yeah.
As Mark Rogers himself has said all the time, there's not much difference between teams ranked anywhere from like 15 to like 35 or 40. It's just all how the records and the schedules balance themselves out. So definitely, both these teams are about even. I would argue actually that Nebraska as a team is a little bit better than Indiana. They probably have, more guys that are going to be in the NFL. Yeah, I've been hyping up IU's guys that should be in the NFL for this season, but Nebraska's got more studs. The only difference is that Indiana has the experienced players in the portal, the Mikel Camaras, the Curtis Rourkes. These guys have been around forever, 5, 6, 7 years in college football. Indiana, out of the 32 seventh-year players in college football this year, Indiana has 4 of them. Indiana has 4 of those 32 seventh-year players. Nebraska, they got some guys that have experience too, but then they got the freshmen. They got Rayola. He's young, going on the road. I'm worried about Indiana in this game because it's the big noon game. They're undefeated. Everybody is hyping them up, the Hoosiers. It could be the game that finally cracks them, but I'm going to go with Indiana to beat Nebraska 28-24. I made that prediction before you said Nebraska couldn't kick a field goal. So
I have the same exact prediction, just the other way.
Okay.
I almost did 28-27, but 28-24. I have the same thing, just the other way. Yeah, no field goals. and
I feel bad that I gave Nebraska a field goal now. I shouldn't have done it. I didn't know.
Hey, listen, it's our good. We'll take it. We'll take it. Well, I mean, we at least made one versus Purdue, so there's a shot.